Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that some truths you've believed all your life were just well-constructed lies? If the answer is no, we're going to change that right now. One of those lies was about the Titanic, the infamous story of 1912 that kept the world at a standstill. This ship was the biggest transporting system ever made by man and sat at the bottom of the Atlantic. We hope lovers of the romance movie Titanic will forgive us for this, but hitting the iceberg wasn't what sank the gigantic ship. Shannon Maloney has over 30 years researching the history of the ship. Analyzing photographs taken before the Titanic sailed, he made an amazing discovery that indicated a huge fire was burning in one of the coal tanks on board more than a week before the vessel left England. As experts continued to examine the photos of the Titanic, they noticed 30-foot-long black marks along the front right-hand side of the hull, just behind where the ship's lining was pierced by the iceberg. Their conclusion was that the marks were likely to have been caused by a fire started in a 3-story high fuel store behind one of the ship's boiler rooms. The estimation is that the heat from the coal fire had weakened the hull by over 75% before the iceberg collision. Had the collision not occurred, the ocean liner would have been blown up into crumbs even before they got to New York. Going a little further into this story, it's uncertain whether there was an iceberg collision at all. Wagenak Borat is one of the survivors and has seen it all with his own eyes, but his version differs from the official one. After the shipwreck, he described in writing what really happened to the Titanic. Wagenak lived a long life and often spoke of his voyage. Most interestingly, the man never mentioned an iceberg. Instead, he always talked about some kind of explosion that had led to the ship's sinking. Many of the survivors claim that there were between 2 and 4 explosions on the Titanic. Researcher and writer Bill Wormstead also provides some accounts of this fact, which he has learned from conversations with survivors. For example, Commander Arthur G. Pitchin, standing next to first-class passengers, heard an explosion, after which the ship began to sink. George Frederick Crowe, who worked in the lifeboat compartment, also said in his interview with the writer that an explosion went off, after which the stern in the lower compartment burst. These are all confirmations to researchers that the Titanic may have sunk because of a strong fire. At the time, the ship's engineers and the entire world were unaware of the danger of electrolysis, which can turn seawater into explosive hydrogen gas. John Wickman cites evidence in his book Titanic that the engineers made a serious mistake. They did not allow for the possibility that an electric current could cause an explosion. Had they foreseen this possibility, the Titanic might not have sunk, and the passengers might have survived. The truth about Trojan Horse. Since the past century, the world has been caught between doubt and belief regarding the existence of this mythic piece of history, the Trojan Horse. The story is that it was the cheat code used by the Greeks to enter the city of Troy and finally win the Trojan War. It is said that this giant horse, made of wood, was built on the orders of the Greek legend Odysseus, who hid in its construction along with other soldiers to capture the city of Troy from within. This wood structure was so powerful that it found its way into classical works. But despite all these, the Trojan horse might just be another moonlight tale by the lake. In the words of the Oxford University classicist Dr. Armand Dangour, archaeological evidence shows that Troy was indeed burned down, but the wooden horse is an imaginative fable, perhaps inspired by the way ancient siege engines were clothed with damp horse hides to stop them from being set alight. There is no concrete evidence that the Trojan horse events, as described by Homer, considered to be the greatest of Greek epic poets, in his works Iliad and Odyssey, actually happened in history. The story of the Trojan Horse was initially presented as a mythological tale, and there are no historical backings that prove that a giant wooden horse used as a booby trap to take Troy under siege ever existed. Most importantly, Greek poets were notable for using striking metaphorical expressions in their works. Homer called ships horses of the deep, and the Greek playwright Euripides compared the horse to the dark hull of a ship. Furthermore, Homer's texts were written some 500 years after the war. Despite all the realism and attention to detail in ancient accounts and depictions of the horse, the historicity of the myth cannot be confirmed. Too much time has passed between the first written accounts of the sack of Troy and the events to which they refer. So for now, the Trojan Horse story is merely a literary device used to bolster the epic tale of the Trojan War, not a factual description of historical events. Nero fiddling while Rome burned. For the most part, Nero lived his life gathering so many enemies. Flipping through history books only reminds you of how cruel he was as a leader. But this was only a little part of Nero's story. In July of 64 AD, Rome was slowly fading to ashes after an uncontrollable fire had broken out. 70% of Rome was swept off in the fire, while over half of the entire Roman citizens were left homeless. After the fire, word of its cause spread quickly. According to one popular account, Nero had planned to build his magnificent palace, the Domus Aurea, but needed to clear a large area to accommodate the palace complex. To this end, he ordered a fire to be set to destroy the aristocratic dwellings on the slopes of the Palatine Hill, and he watched with glee as the flames engulfed Rome, even whistling to himself during the process. Then, of course, he needed a scapegoat for his actions, so he blamed the Christians for the fire, citing their apocalyptic belief that Rome and the world would end in fire. This led to an active campaign against them. Both the fire and the persecution of Christians became the defining image of his reign. But how much of this story is really true? According to historical archives, Nero was 35 miles away from Rome when the fire broke out on his way to Antium. When he returned to the city, he organized relief efforts, opened his personal property to provide shelter for the displaced, and even volunteered personal funds. But people found this hard to believe, considering the name he had built over time. Roman historian Tacitus, who lived during Nero's reign, makes no mention of Nero playing music while the city burned. Instead, Tacitus and other ancient sources indicate that Nero was scapegoated and falsely accused of causing the fire to clear room for his self-exonerating building projects. The fiddling story emerged later, likely as political propaganda to further discredit Nero's reputation. While Nero's reign was undoubtedly controversial, it's important to separate the historical reality from legendary tales that have persisted over the centuries. Was Napoleon short? All through history, only a few men came close to the greatness of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French military general and statesman stood as one of the pioneers of the French Revolution, and also served as the first consul of France. But even with this wealth of achievements, Napoleon was regarded as a short fellow. But how true is this? Taking a closer look at the facts surrounding Napoleon's height and stature, the next few minutes of this video will clear the fog. During his time, particularly in 18th and 19th century France, where he lived, the average height for French men was around 5 feet 4 inches. When compared to this standard, Napoleon's reported height at the time of his demise in 1821 was 5 feet 7 inches, which was, in fact, slightly above average for the time. An often overlooked reason behind the myth of Napoleon's small stature was also propagated by the way he was portrayed in political cartoons and caricatures of the era, which often exaggerated his small size to mock his outsized ambition and ego. Napoleon spent the bulk of his years as a victim of English caricaturists. One of the particularly popular scatological cartoons from 1798 portrayed Napoleon standing on the French coast without his pants and farting out balloons and guillotines. These exaggerated illustrations were intended to undermine his authority and presence rather than accurately reflect his physical appearance. Also, Napoleon's height was measured using the French pied du roi system, which was slightly different from the modern metric system we use today. When his height is converted to the modern metric system, it becomes clear that he was closer to 5'6" inches, a height that would be considered above average for a man of his time. There is evidence that Napoleon's height may have been deliberately understated for political purposes. During his lifetime, his political rivals and enemies often spread rumors and propaganda about his small stature in an attempt to portray him as weak, fragile, and unfit for leadership. This narrative was then perpetuated and amplified over the centuries, becoming the accepted historical truth. Napoleon's military success and strategic brilliance had little to do with his physical size. He was a formidable commander who led his armies to numerous victories. But that's a topic for another video, and if you want it in the comments, we'll do it. Until then, you can enjoy the 4 ancient armies that have disappeared without a trace, including that of Abu Bakr II, ruler of the Mali Empire. He and his 2,000 ships never returned from their mysterious expedition. To find out what it was, just click the thumbnail on the screen now, and we'll see there in a second.